Welcome to the Flip Your Script podcast. I'm Kristi Piehl. She scaled cliffs, she escaped death, but her greatest achievement is finding a way to love herself. That's what Amazon Publishing says about Beth Rodden's new book called A Light Through the Cracks. Beth is an elite athlete who pushed the sport of rock climbing forward by accomplishing many incredible feats and winning many awards. But based on what I've read about her, the hardest work she's ever done didn't happen on a rock. Beth, welcome to the Flip Your Script podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
After reading your story and hearing more about you and what you've gone through, I think the place to start with your story perhaps is your teenager perfectionism, like the root of that, because I think the part of the story that when I see it talked about, people go to kidnapping. They go to kidnapping and healing. And for the purposes of our audience, very few people, thank goodness, won't be kidnapped. But most people have to heal from something. And oftentimes it starts with something like that perfectionism, that drive, that is something everyone can connect. Many people can connect with. So let's start there and then we'll kind of work our way forward.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think I've always had a bit of perfectionism in me. You know, growing up, I can remember early on, even in fourth and fifth grade, worrying about my homework and if it was correct and not. But I think it really came to the surface when I started climbing and when I started getting recognized for my climbing, and being told that I was doing really well. And it felt good to be told that. It felt good to be recognized. And I didn't want to rock that boat. I didn't want to do anything that could shift people's perspectives, could shift that narrative that I was hearing. And so I really heightened everything to try and make it so, you know, I walked this really fine line and I didn't deviate from it. And I think that's when the perfectionism came, really to the surface, the eating disorders started. And that's kind of when all that was wrapped up and was in my life.
And that is sort of the backdrop that's happening kind of internally while you're winning awards and while you're kind of climbing the next thing and doing the next feat and the only woman that's ever, or the third person in the world who, I mean, all these kind of things are happening. And so you have this perfectionism working, you have this sort of belief that, boy, if I can control everything, I am in full control and power. And if I want amazing things, I just got to work harder, right? Those were some of the things happening that you believed were true that, as you learn later, were lies.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like living alongside perfectionism is control. And I felt that that's, you know, I can control my eating. I can control when I train. I can control, you know, who I hang out with. I can control all those sorts of things, kind of this narrative and then this life and kind of build it up. And so as, you know, all that sort of thing started happening, all those accolades, all the awards, all the competitions, it really kind of cemented that, oh, this is how success happens. This is where I'm supposed to be.
And I think, listeners, it's important to get that what she just described, many people, I suspect women, can really connect with. And when you get to the kidnapping part, it's easy to say, oh my goodness, that would never happen to me. And then you kind of wipe away all the rest of it. But remember, when she's talking about this, the kidnapping thing hasn't happened yet. So this is kind of normal teenage woman, elite athlete or not. We, to some degree, all, I think, have some version of that going on in our head.
Absolutely. And especially as women, I feel like, and especially back then, being a woman who was at the top of a male-driven sport, at the top of a male-driven field, there was, you know, very little room for many of us, right? There was like the token one or two seats at the table. And so if I didn't walk that fine line, if I didn't kind of, you know, subscribe to the dialogue and do all that sort of thing, then somebody quickly else would have, you know, they would have come in and taken that seat that I had. So it was a very tenuous time in that, like, I felt very grateful. I felt like I had this rare thing and I needed to keep it.
And I think success makes that even more challenging because I think when you're in the midst of whatever the unhealthy cycle might be or the potentially long-term damaging cycle is, when you have success, it's really hard to look in the mirror and to say something I'm doing isn't working because everything externally would say, oh no, what you're doing is working great. Do more of it.
Absolutely. I mean, the entire feedback is that this is what I should be doing. This is what you should be doing because look at, you're on magazine covers, you've got a raise, you got to go on this trip, you got featured in a movie, whatnot. And so I feel like it's a pretty general thing that can be not just in climbing or in sport, but in all the fields. When you're getting those outside accolades, when you're getting that outside praise, of course you want to keep doing it, even though it's potentially not the right thing for you.
And at some point, the reality is, like it or not, if that stuff is in the background of your psyche, it's coming out sideways. You don't have to deal with it now or find healthy ways to deal with it, but at some point, it's coming out.
Yeah, I feel like at some point it bubbles up. It'll bubble up in ways that you least expect it. And that you're kind of like, wow, wait, is this connected? Why is this happening? And then, at some point I realized that, oh yeah, this is coming from this place a long time ago in my teenage years.
And yet you hadn't come to that realization when you went on the foreign trip where the kidnapping happened. So can you talk us through, now that we have sort of the stage set and the mindset that you brought to that trip, what happened?
Absolutely. So to set the stage a little, I was newly 20 at the time. I was on my quote unquote year off of college. So I had convinced my parents to let me leave college and kind of pursue this climbing life for just a year. And so I felt very on top of the world, right? I felt very like I am winning. My poor high school friends in some cubicle with fluorescent lights, like here I am living my life on far corners of the earth in these beautiful valleys. So we went over to Kyrgyzstan, which was known for the type of rock climbing that we wanted to do. If anyone's familiar with Yosemite Valley, it's like a Yosemite Valley at a higher altitude. So big granite walls.
And if someone's like Googling and trying to spell that, tell us what part of the world that is.
It's in Southeast Asia. So it was part of, the old Soviet Union and some of those countries that really got divided up and kind of intertwined like fingers. So yeah, it was beautiful. I mean, for a climber, it was everything you wanted, right? It was these beautiful walls, these snow-capped mountains, this lush river valley. If you're a foodie and you go to San Francisco or New York for the first time, it was like that. It was like for climbers, it was the pinnacle of going somewhere. And so for the first couple weeks, we lived out our dreams. We were kids and we were climbing on these walls and having the time of our lives. And we met the locals and they were really friendly. But 2 weeks in, everything changed. As climbers, a lot of times when you can't make it from the bottom to the top in a day, you'll take all of your stuff with you and you'll sleep on things that we call portaledges, which are like hanging cots. And so we were sleeping on these portaledges and we woke up to armed men shooting up at us. And so it was apparent at that point that we were being kidnapped and taken hostage. And for the next 6 days, we went through a massive battle between the Kyrgyzstan military and the rebels that had taken us hostage. People were killed. We were starving for 6 days. We were freezing for 6 days. We didn't know what was happening. So it was a really terrifying experience for all of us.
And why did they take you?
We still don't know. We didn't speak their language and they didn't speak English. We've only assumed that running across, 4 Americans on their path was seen as a good opportunity. So potentially human shields, potentially ransom money. We actually have no idea why they took us.
So they take you, they split you up. literally at one point have, it seems like, have no idea what to do with you because they're kind of marching you on this death march in circles. They don't, they're, they split up, and then someone in your group takes an opportunity to hurt, to try to kill, but did die. Spoiler alert. But got rid of, effectively got rid of one of the kidnappers so you could escape. So you were held hostage, and then you effectively escaped. And that's how you made it out of there, is because you outnumbered your captor.
Absolutely. Yeah, we had an opportunity on the last night of captivity where our captors split up. We thought one of them was going to find more food and supplies, and we were left with one of them on a scrambling up a ridge. And as climbers, we were very comfortable on that terrain. It was like, for us, it was like walking on a sidewalk, but for somebody that wasn't a climber, it was very uncomfortable. So Tommy, my boyfriend at the time, took the opportunity and pushed him off the cliff, and then we were able to run down canyon to a military base and to safety.
And when you get to safety and you have this experience with other people, that, I mean, it's traumatic. There's post-traumatic stress things. I mean, there's so many things going on. Did you decide to deal with that right away? Did you stuff it? Like, talk about what your response was to that.
Absolutely. This was in 2000, so it was before 9/11. And also, part of the climbing community and the culture at that point was skirting death was pretty celebrated, honestly. It was kind of like this chest thumping thing, because a lot of times, a lot of people, to get to the summit of the mountain, had to go through harrowing tales, right? They survived a storm, they ran out of food, they took a big fall, something like that. And so it was this pretty celebrated thing in our community. And add on to the fact that nearly 25 years ago, therapy wasn't as commonplace just in society as it is now. Growing up as a kid, I didn't know of adults or, kids that went to therapy. So when we came back, it was shocking. It was, I had nightmares. I was scared. But all the external stuff around me in this community that I was so convinced I needed to be a part of and at the top of was telling me how amazing I was, how great this experience was, how much it made me stronger. And so it was a pretty isolating experience, honestly. And at some point, I was in this place where I was really confused and I felt in limbo. And I saw everyone else around me going on and finding joy and finding purpose with climbing. So I thought I just needed to stuff this experience down as far as possible and pursue on with climbing, which is what I did.
It's really interesting that in certain, communities that difficult of an experience would be sort of a celebrated, like, Medal of Honor kind of thing. But military has been doing that for decades and decades, right? And to your point, it was 20 some years ago. So if you're a Gen Zer and listening, you have no idea what it was like to be in the world where mental health wasn't something that was talked about like it is today. And it's such a gift, I think, of the generations, younger than me and younger than you that are, I suspect if that were to happen now, you'd get back and either the government or your family or all the people around you would say, why don't you take a month, 2 months, 3 months off and let's go get intensive therapy. But that just wasn't how it was.
Not at all. Yeah, it was much more, what's your next climb? Where are you going next? And I know just a few months after I got back from Kyrgyzstan, my main sponsor at the time, requested my presence on a photo shoot in Thailand. And so to travel internationally immediately again was just so scary and so foreign. And I felt ashamed of it. I felt that I couldn't tell anyone because, again, if I told someone, it would be seen as weakness. I wouldn't get invited on the next trip. I would probably get dropped from my sponsor. And so all these things are wrapped up into one and just kind of solidified that I needed to shove this experience down and just, develop a stronger, this made me stronger narrative, that I would say.
And what's fascinating about it, I think that other folks can connect to, is that ultimately you were afraid. Like you were afraid of having to confront it. And yet I've seen the pictures of you, and we've had other climbers on sleeping on the side of a mountain. You're like ridiculously high in the air on basically what looks like a hammock. I mean, I know that it's safer than that, but to an untrained person, that looks really scary. But the scary thing that sort of you needed to confront was the thing that was easiest not to deal with when you were doing physically scary things. It's such a
Yeah,
juxtaposition to like think about.
it really is. I feel like, maybe maybe I can separate it and say, well, the physical things, like all those things that seem foreign to other people, that's where I felt like I could control, right? I could double check. I'm like, I'm clipped in here. This has been tested many times over, and I could understand that. But all the other stuff, it just felt like there was no way to control it. It felt so scary to try and dive in and really unwrap things.
Other thing that I was struck by in reading your story is that had it not, it appears from the outside looking in, that had it not been for the kidnapping, the really, really significant event, you may not have needed to or ever had to deal with, frankly, the control and the perfectionism and all these other things, which many, many people spend their whole life just with that sort of the undercurrent of their entire life. And it negatively impacts many things. They just don't have to deal with it because it's not the big scary monster in the corner. The kidnapping sort of forced you to deal with a whole bunch of things and things that you wouldn't have otherwise had to deal with. So have you thought about it that way? Has that struck you that in some ways that terrible, terrible thing has this silver lining because you had to confront the stuff that you really needed to look at?
Absolutely. I feel like I was able to, I thought, successfully shove the kidnapping and the aftermath and any PTSD or lingering things down for, nearly 15 years. And then when I became a mother, like we talked about earlier, things started bubbling up in ways that I never expected. I never thought, I was living this, again, a very rigid way and a very controlled life for those 15 years. I controlled where I traveled, I controlled, you know, any big crowds I was in, anything like that. And I felt like, well, this is the success, right? This is what I've learned. But, having a child, it is a very quick way to realize that you have to loosen that tight grip of control, that it's not possible. And so that's when I realized I needed to start to unpack all this stuff. And once I started unpacking the kidnapping and what happened in Kyrgyzstan, it was kind of a snowball effect. And it made me look at other parts of my life with more of a discerning eye and like, oh, wait, maybe how I've thought I needed to be super rigid and restricted with eating, maybe that's not also something, and all these other things. So it was this, you know, maybe blessing in disguise or whatnot to be able to go to therapy, to be able to see and unravel things that, I had really lived by scripture for so long.
Yeah, kids will mess with your plans, won't they?
Absolutely.
It is really interesting, I think, when therapy still has stigma in many circles and with different age groups and different genders and different all sorts of things. But when you say to most people now, hey, I was kidnapped, I mean, like, oh, there's no shame in going to therapy. I think it's really difficult when someone doesn't even know how to name the thing that's bubbling up, doesn't even know how to name where that maybe unsettled feeling is. And I've said it many times on this podcast, everyone needs a therapist. It's just so much value in just talking with someone else and thinking about things from a third party's point of view, a trained professional, because you don't need to have the kidnapping or the rape or the murder or the terrible childhood trauma to benefit from talking to someone else.
Absolutely. I feel like it is such a blessing if you're privileged enough and have the means to be able to go to therapy, which, fortunately I have been. And to be able, like you said, to have someone, because a lot of the things, just normal human life things, will have these stigmas and you'll be ashamed of it, and but to be able to talk about that with somebody, to be able to have it aired out in a safe place, always made me realize how not alone I was in that thinking, and how it was okay to have this complex range of emotions, right? You don't just need to live this thin line that we see in magazines and television and that type of thing.
Yeah, when we're children, we learn to cope. And oftentimes, the ways that we learn to cope isn't the best way to cope. It's a way to cope. And I mean, for me, having children, not only do they, throw all thoughts of control out the window, but also I found at different ages, as my kids reach different ages, I go back to the things that were happening in my life at that age, and I process them in different ways and think about them in different ways, and I'm aware of how much the world has changed and how different perspectives and different influences have changed the way that even I'm able to parent my children and what's acceptable with my kids in different ways. And to think, weird that this was normal in the 80s. How did we possibly let this happen and have these kinds of conversations around children? And I'm sure, my kids will be having that with their kids and whatever. And they'll say, Grandma, why did you let Dad do this? And I'm like, well, sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
We do the best we can, right? We do the best we can. But having kids does throw everything into kind of all the things that you thought you knew about how the world works. No, maybe not.
Yeah, I always have thought, that parenting is just like this crystal clear reflection on how we're living in the world. And, it's wild to think about sometimes. And it's wild to think back again to how we were raised. And it'll be probably a total trip if our kids ever have kids, to think about how things have changed by then.
Wild. I want to shift a bit as something that, I read that you wrote, and I think it's really insightful. And we'll post a link to this article that I think is from 2017, but you finished this article and you said, I try to remember that bravery is specific and personal, and that the kind of strength I want can't be measured in pull-ups. Which encapsulates much of the conversation so far. But when you define strength now or bravery now, how do you think about that?
I think it's so hard to put one word to it. I think if you would have asked me 20, 25 years ago, I would probably have some very tactful, great answer. But I think what has changed for me the most with that question, or with that line of thinking, is it's everywhere, right? I feel like for me in my community, it was always measured by how hard you could climb, how brave you were in risking death, how big of a mountain you've done in a little bit of a time. But again, I think that being a mom, seeing what moms do, seeing what parents do, I'm like, why isn't this as celebrated? Or, for the longest time, all my peer group was just professional climbers. And as I've gotten older, I have friends in all sorts of fields, and, seeing what they do, I'm like, well, that's pretty amazing and important. And why aren't we celebrating that? So I feel like, at least as I've evolved and started to grow up, just really questioning why certain things are celebrated and why others aren't. Maybe it makes a good story, maybe it makes a good image or a good film, but I feel like it's everywhere, honestly.
And it's such a, I don't know, mind bend sort of to think about that there are so many things that driven A-type folks do that are the success metric or are the strength metric, and it's very easy to define. And to some degree, I think I would argue that those are the easiest things to do, because it just really takes, for most people, able-bodied folks, it takes money, training, time, experts, and most of those kinds of success metrics things can be accomplished. I mean, I'm not going to be Anthony Edwards ever and dunk a basketball, but if I wanted to hire a coach, I could get better at it. I could probably achieve some sort of reasonable goals that I would set for myself. But the actual things that will really impact the things that I define as most important to me, which would be my children and that legacy, that sort of stuff, there's not a metric. There's no way to say, like, I'm a good parent because X. Because if I say, well, if my kid does this, well, that's really screwed up. So it's sort of that internal work that you have to define on your own. And that's the hardest work to do, I think.
Exactly. I feel that, you have these external validating things that happen, whether it's you get the promotion or you get the raise or you've, climbed the mountain or you've swam as fast as you can. But for me, I always felt when I was at the top of the sport, I just felt this I always felt that at some point I'd feel this inner calm or contentedness, and every achievement never kind of filled that up. And so at what point is trying to be content in the world or trying to be kinder with yourself or more accepting, at what point are those not as important as these big things that we all get ribbons for or we get pats on the back for?
Yeah, it's so true. And again, I was excited to talk with you, and I want to apologize because in my going through the questions I wanted to ask and talking with you, I forgot two really important things. I forgot to, first of all, tell you congratulations on all of your success and the courage to write the book. And I'm really sorry that you went through the experience that you went through.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for taking the time to read. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, and all of these things you could have been working on with your therapist. You could have been working on in a journal. You could have been talking to your husband and your loved ones about. You chose to write a book. You chose to do all of this on a pretty big stage and to be very vulnerable. And going to me, when I think about your story and the flip your script part of it, it's this strength and rigidity to this weakness and vulnerability and awareness of the things that you can't control and being honest about that. Why did you choose to share your story?
I think I always feel the most connected with people when we have those conversations, when it feels vulnerable and we're not just telling each other our highlight reels, when we're just humans and then we're these messy humans that have these complex emotions. And whether that's on a close friend level that I feel connected, or, if I'm at an event and we let down our guard and do that sort of thing. And I just feel that that's one of the greatest gifts, right? Is what I've gained from hearing other people's human stories and vulnerable stories. And I think the more we can do that, the more connected and accepted we'll feel. And so I feel like it's just always felt like something to do to build that strength between people and to build that, connection.
So important, especially when you think about how you would have defined or answered all of my questions, at least the ones outside of the kidnapping questions, when you were 16 or 17. And when we release this episode, I'd like to connect it to people graduating college specifically, because I think it's so easy to connect the success with the job thing, the promotion thing, the grad school thing. And in the midst of that pursuit, damage can happen to those around you and yourself as well.
Absolutely. It's, growing up, there was always the recommended books, right? And it was all about, 6 ways to achieve happiness. Or if it was a climbing book, it was like how I, overcame this adversity to conquer the mountain. But, I think it would be a great service to people to show the human stories and be like, you can wander through life and get lost for a long time. And it doesn't mean that, you're actually lost, or you can choose a different path and it's is equally viable as, the 4 degrees you have and the 7 promotions you'll get. And I think we need to hear all the stories, right? Not just one end of the spectrum or another. It's like we need to hear them all, because that's what really shows us that, we're all connected and not alone.
100% agree. And the folks who are listening who cannot connect with being an elite athlete, cannot connect with the kidnapping, cannot connect with some of the things you shared. I can't imagine anyone listening to this, all the different things that we've talked about, and saying, yeah, none of that ever happened to me, because I think then they're in denial. And, when I was a younger woman, I would hear, oh, age and wisdom and all these things. And I would think, like, right, all that happens when you get old is you get wrinkled, or you lose things, or whatever. And boy, it's so true. With age does come the wisdom, but I think with an asterisk, only if you do the work. Only if you're willing to really vulnerably look and say, boy, what else do I need to learn? Because everything that we've talked about in one big encapsulated sentence is, it's important to be a lifelong learner about yourself.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, it's hard, but what an opportunity as well, right? To see where you can go and where you can grow. And, I'm sure in 20 years, if you and I had this conversation again, we'd have vastly different answers and vastly different, things that we conclude. And that's kind of one of the neatest things, honestly.
And let's hope so, right? Because if we did have the same conversation and it was kind of the same themes, that meant that we spent 20 years not changing, not evolving, not growing, not learning, not having conversations with different types of people, or engaging with the communities around us, or having new experiences. That would be really sad. And I think there are people out there who, if you gave them 10 questions now and 10 questions in 50 years or 50 years in the past, their answers would be kind of the same. And boy, that's a disservice to yourself, to whatever your purpose on this planet is, to those people around you. Deep thoughts.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it can be scary to let new thoughts in and totally, think about things differently. But then it's pretty amazing to be able to look back and be like, wow, when I was this age, I thought that total opposite about this same thing.
Because different influences, different thinking, and it isn't, I think, oh boy, I was wrong, or that I was bad or something. It's like, no, you just have new information, and you processed and explored and talked to new people and came to a different conclusion. And that's great.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's being a human.
Being a human, leaning fully into what is the human experience, right?
Yep.
Well, Beth, thank you for sharing your story. All the best as you share your story on bigger stages, as your book is out, and as you're in the biggest adventure of your life, the parenting adventure. Last question. Is there a quote that you could share with the audience about how you've been motivated to so passionately and impressively flip your script?
Yes, I think it can be applied to different things, but it's a climbing quote that somebody said to me when I first was a new mom. And it's, the rocks will always be there. In that I always thought that I needed to go back and get on the exact same track that I was on, that, I needed to go back. I needed to become my old person and just, go back into what I knew. But it was a good reminder that I still have today, that it's okay to deviate, because that will always be there if you want to come back to it. And so it's just always a great reminder for me that I can try these other things. I can, pursue another path. And if that doesn't work, then it'll always be there.
It's a great quote. And I think about too, it speaks to some of the things we've talked about, which, if the rock comes to symbolize the challenge, and you don't want to deal with it now, eventually to get over it means you have to go through it.
Yep, absolutely.
And you can avoid it, but at some point, a rock's still there.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for, again, sharing your story, writing the book, being vulnerable with your experience, and we'll continue to cheer you on.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So this week's Flip Your Script Challenge, I think to do the work and the things that we talked about, have you ever thought about how you define strength? Have you ever thought about how you personally consider strength, bravery, courage, success, even just defining these different things and not having it be about a metric or a thing that you could hire out or be coached on, but something else. And that is hard work. And it isn't an answer that you sit down and write in your journal and like, oh, I figured it out. It's an always evolving, always changing, always a topic that constant curiosity, I think, is so important. So anyway, how do you define success? How do you define strength? And have you ever even thought about it? Have a conversation with someone about that. That's the Flip Your Script Challenge of the week. My hope is Beth's story empowers you to believe you're capable of more than you think, to discover motivation, to uncover inspiration, and to find the strength to turn the page.